Howdy, historians. Welcome to World War II Part 7 as we start to get into some more of the fighting of the war today. We've seen just some of the opening events so far that got the war going. You know, the takeover of Czechoslovakia, the invasion of Poland, and then Hitler starting to extend his reach throughout Europe. You know, we've talked in general a little bit about the Japanese expanding their empire, the Italians expanding their empire, and the events at Pearl Harbor. But today we'll start to get into the actual fighting and events of the war, something that typically are focused on a lot. To be honest with you, this is going to be brief. You could do an entire semester course. You could do a year-long course just about the fighting in Europe. You could do a year-long course just about the fighting in the Pacific. You could do a semester-long course just about the decisions to drop the atomic bomb. You could do, a year-long course on the Holocaust. There's so many different aspects to this that you could get into crazy detail about. And honestly, I encourage you to. If this is something that interests you, grab a couple books, watch a couple documentaries, do some online researching. There's so much information out there about World War II, and so much of it is just fascinating. But, we're on a canned curriculum here with the AP, and they tell us what they want us to focus on. And, of course, we don't have an entire semester. We don't have a year, right? We've got a limited amount of time. So as we get ready to start looking at fighting a multi-front war, first, before we even get to the goals in 1942, let's just understand what we're talking about here, right? There's two what you would call theaters of war. Okay, so a theater is just like an area, a geographic area of war. You have one theater in Europe where you're going to see the Allies, the English, the French, and the Americans primarily. There were others, but those are the big three. The English, the French, the Americans fighting against the Germans and the Italians, right? And then you have the Pacific theater of war where you're just going to have America versus Japan. All right, those are the theaters. So you have the Pacific theater and you have the European theater. So it's a multi-front, multi-theater war that we're going to see in World War II. So when the U.S. gets involved in the beginning of 1942, remember Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. So when we start to ramp up our war efforts in 1942, we need to talk to some other leaders around the world and then talk to our military and civil leaders about how are we going to fight this multi-front war. And the decision is made with Great Britain and the Allies that the focus is going to be all the Allied powers are going to put all of their chips, all their efforts into defeating the Germans and the Italians first. And then after they defeat the Axis powers in Europe, they would help the Americans with the Japanese in the Pacific. Now, the American decision is we're going to fight on both fronts because we have to. We're going to help the English fight against the Germans, and we're going to help in Europe. And then we're also going to fight the Japanese at the same time. So luckily, we have a very large population, and we have a lot of resources and a thriving economy that are going to be able to support both of those war efforts, something that a lot of countries would not be able to do. So our main goals in 1942, one, we have to mobilize. We talked about that last time. We have to get the economy thriving so that way we have the materials, the food, the tanks, the planes, the boots, the backpacks, the ammo to be able to fight this war. So we have to mobilize. That is happening and happening very quickly. We also need to train our soldiers. We need to get a very large military created here and trained so that way we can effectively fight. And then we need to roll back some of the gains that our enemies have made. Japan is clearly on the aggressive in the Pacific. They've taken over some American possessions. They've taken over French and English possessions. They have this massive Pacific empire. We need to kind of hold serve. We need to kind of just hold up against them and not get pushed back even further, and then eventually start to counterattack. And it's the same thing in Europe. Germany has taken over North Africa, and again, the African theater, they have some help from the Italians. So the German and the Italian forces have taken over Northern Africa, and then it's primarily the German forces that have taken over all of Europe, except for Russia because they have a non-aggression pact, Spain because they basically have a non-aggression pact, and Great Britain because they're trying to, but they can't. The Germans are bombing Great Britain just day and night, non-stop. Most of London is a pile of rubble, but they haven't launched an actual invasion yet. So we've got to push back the gains that our enemies have made. We've got to mobilize. We've got to train. So those are our main goals in 1942 as we start to get ready to push into Europe here and try to have some success. Now, the way that we're going to try to really attack and achieve these goals, push the Germans back. One, we've got to overcome German submarine attacks. Just like in World War I, in World War II, the Germans have very good submarines, and they're really way ahead of everybody else. The Americans have some submarines, but they're not close to the level and sophistication and complexity that the Germans have. So the Germans are sinking record numbers of ships off the coast of Europe with their submarines. We've got to find a way to defend ourselves against that and overcome these German submarine attacks. And then we've got to start really attacking German infrastructure, and we're going to do that with lots of bombing raids. Lots of bombing raids. The British are going to bomb at night, the Americans are going to bomb during the day, and gradually we're going to start to eliminate the infrastructure that's supplying the German military with the goods and supplies that they need. Eventually we also overcome the German submarine attacks in two ways. One, we start this escort system where basically ships roll in packs, so that way they can try to spot these German submarines and sink them. But the biggest thing is eventually the Allied powers developed something called sonar. Sonar is where you can basically, it's like echolocation. It's how like dolphins hunt in the ocean. You send out a signal. If the signal hits something, it bounces back, and then you can see what is underwater. So eventually we figure out how to spot and track these submarines and neutralize them with sonar. We neutralize some of their effectiveness with the escort system, and then we also just bomb Germany like crazy, and these things are going to start to accomplish our goals. But now I've got to actually get on the ground. Right? So one of the first things we want to do is we want to go from North Africa to Italy. So we're going to kind of attack the underbelly of the Atlantic shield that Germany has created. All right, so as we get ready to start looking at North Africa onto Italy, there are two maps here that I have blown up on the screen that I want to look at. The first is what was known as the Atlantic Wall, 1942-1944. This was a massive basically defense system that the Germans had set up. So because Germany has taken over basically all of Europe, you can see Sweden neutral, Switzerland neutral, Spain neutral, Portugal just got lucky because they're engulfed by Spain. All of these, you know, this green line here that you can go, the Germans had massive defense systems set up, basically blocking Great Britain and the United States from being able to push in and attack them. They also have North Africa under wraps, and of course Italy under wraps too. So it's very difficult to attack their defenses as they have taken over basically all of Europe, right? But of course, we have to find a way to start attacking this Atlantic Wall. Now, the Atlantic Wall is very strong up in this northern region because, of course, that's where the British are, the English are. That's, you know, the area that you really need to watch out for the most. The Germans also understood as well that when the United States came to help, they're going to stage up in England and then push in to make their attack. So we tried to throw them off a little bit. We decided to try to go into North Africa and attack kind of like the underbelly, the area that wasn't as well guarded and well defended, and it was a good move. So the Allies have this enormous task of removing the Germans from their positions where they're heavily entrenched. So we started something called Operation Torch in late fall of 1942, and this is the campaign to liberate North Africa from German and Italian control. Dwight Eisenhower is the American general that's in control. The British general is Bernard Montgomery. And the Allied forces succeeded in liberating North Africa by May of 1943. So now that you've taken North Africa, now you can start to push into actually, you know, mainland Western Europe. So you're going to try to go up through Italy. Now this was very difficult. You can see on the map that we will liberate Rome on June 4th of 1944. But even after that, the Nazis held up and were able to maintain large defensive fortifications in northern Italy. Eventually, the Allies are going to kind of go around them to be able to get across the Alps and push into Germany, but it's going to be difficult to do, but we start to see some early success. We're able to push back in North Africa and liberate with some very intense and difficult desert fighting. We're able to liberate large portions of Italy, even though the Germans and the Italians prop up Mussolini and are able to maintain some defensive positions, but we're starting to make some strides in the southern portion here. Now we need to try to find a way to get in and make some gains in the northern portions of the Germans' Atlantic defensive wall, and we're going to do that with D-Day. All right, now this is something that, again, very, very well documented throughout history, something that many people probably know at least a little bit about. This is the plan for attacking the Germans and pushing through to start the liberation of France and then other areas. So this is a map of the actual beachhead. All right, so you can see there are a number of different beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. All right, Omaha Beach is probably the best known part of D-Day. D-Day is the largest sea invasion in history, and it began the Allied drive to liberate France. It takes place on June 6th of 1944, so shortly after the liberation of Rome. Here you have British, United States, and Canadian forces led by General Eisenhower. They're storming this beach largely known as Normandy Beach, but then you can see the specific beachheads that we just talked about. They're going to try to break the Atlantic barrier, liberate France, and then start to push on Germany itself. Now, some beachheads went relatively easily. Other beachheads like Omaha were very well fortified by the Germans and were very, very difficult to breach. However, this was a successful operation. We were able to take Normandy Beach in June of 1944. By August of 1944, Paris was liberated. By September of 1944, Allied troops were crossing the German border for the final push on Berlin. And the Germans could see that things were starting to get out of hand and they were starting to lose control. So if we go back to this map here, you can see a couple different things. Here's the D-Day right up here. All right, Paris liberated. All right, now the Germans start to realize things are going bad by December 1944, and they launched this huge attack, the Battle of the Bulge. You can see it up here. All right, December 16th of 1944 to January 31st of 1945. So this is a huge battle. It was a counterattack that the Germans launched. Honestly, they knew that they had to be successful here, or they weren't going to be able to keep up with the Allies. The bombing raids were working. The Germans did not have a lot of materials left to be able to keep fighting. The Germans did not have enough men left to be able to keep fighting. By this point, they're robbing the cradle and the grave. Young men, the age of 14, old men, the age of 65, are fighting. It was a big counterattack, but the Allies were able to kind of hold it, counterattack eventually, reorganize, and then resume their advance. And then we were able to push in very deep into Germany. Again, the bombing raids had drastically reduced Germany's ability to have the industrial capacity to keep fighting. We reduced the amount of men that they had to keep fighting. Hitler recognized this and knew that the end was near. It was April 30th of 1945 that he and his advisors are in bunkers underneath Berlin. And on April 30th, 1945, you have the Allies coming in from the west. By this point, Germany had launched a failed invasion of the Soviet Union. So now the Soviet Union is no longer their ally, but now their enemy. So you have the Russians pushing in from the east. You have the Allies pushing in from the west. They're surrounding Berlin. Italy has fallen. Japan is crumbling and never was able to specifically help Germany. And on April 30th, 1945, Hitler and his mistress Eva Braun committed suicide. Hitler bit a cyanide capsule and shot himself at the same time. Eva Braun ate a cyanide capsule. Eventually, it was some Russian troops that discovered Hitler. One of the unfortunate parts is that they were using flamethrowers in the bunkers, so Hitler's remains were charred and burned, which leads to some great conspiracy theories that Hitler escaped to Germany and lived out his life in South Africa, because many Nazi war criminals did escape Germany and live out their life South America. Many did escape and live out their days in South America. So it was really a combination of manpower. The Allies had more men. A combination of mobilization. The Allies had more supplies. And also one of the biggest advantages that the Allies had was that America was never directly attacked. You know, London was bombed to smithereens. Paris and France was bombarded and bombed to smithereens. Germany was absolutely destroyed during the war. The United States was never really touched. I mean, granted, Pearl Harbor, yes, but it's not like there were large-scale bombing raids. We maintained our industrial capacity to be able to fulfill the equipment that we needed to be victorious. And that is one of the big reasons why the Allies were successful in Europe. All right, come back to the next video. We'll talk about the Holocaust and the end in Europe.